Murhaf, if you could come up and now broaden our perspective to Syria. We've been, I think, given a very interesting and rich menu of ideas and some very, very provocative thoughts on both the Palestinian and Israeli front. So, Murhaf, over to you.
Thank you very much, Toni. I'm very honored to be here. I thank the Middle East Institute. The bad news is I am far less eloquent than the two previous panelists. The good news is I'm going to be much more brief. I think the way the Middle East Institute approached this, to talk about domestic obstacles, truly is far more productive than the alternative, which is to lay blame here and there. Although I'm going to have to engage in that, I cannot change my skin. I take issue, for example, with Toni's statement at the outset, or the question rather, of when will Syria take steps toward peace. I also take issue with a sentence in the letter of invitation for me to speak here by Ambassador Chamberlain, who asks whether a rejectionist Syrian regime is ready to make a paradigm shift. Rejectionist. Syria crossed the distance from seeking the liberation of Palestine to the containment of Israel within the 67 boundaries, a de facto recognition of Israel within the 67 boundaries. Syria crossed the distance from seeking non-belligerence with Israel to seeking, and I quote, normal, peaceful relations based on the UN Land for Peace resolutions. Syria was the first to accept the US invitation to the Madrid conference, which gave rise to the Middle East peace process, which itself paved the way for the declaration of principles between Palestinians and Israelis and a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. Syria negotiated directly with a number of consecutive Israeli governments from 1991 to 2000, including the governments of Rabin, Peres, Netanyahu, and Barak. And if the talks failed in March 2000, it is because the former Prime Minister Barak, according to the memoirs of former President Bill Clinton, Prime Minister Barak at the time got cold feet by offering Syria less than a total withdrawal on the Golan. By contrast, Syria acquiesced to Israel's three requirements for peace, and these were normalization of relations, the establishment of a mutual security regime, and a joint water-sharing mechanism. Despite the failure in the talks, later the administration of Bashar al-Assad sought and later obtained a resumption of talks with Israel, albeit indirectly through Turkey as the mediator. And on the eve of the fifth round of talks, which apparently all of them, and especially the fourth, were promising talks, Israel then, of course, went to war in Gaza, and the talks were interrupted. So given this history, I can hardly call Syria rejectionist. What will it take Syria to go back to the negotiating table? An Israeli commitment to withdraw to the June 4th lines and to resume the talks from the point at which they had ended. Let us, for the sake of argument, let us assume that Israeli leaders today commit to withdrawing their forces from the Golan until the June 4th lines. Would Syria accept peace? Is there no internal opposition? Well, under the days of Hafez al-Assad, there was near unanimity that Syria should not make peace with Israel unless Israel withdraws to the June 4th lines. I think this is very much the case today. In the, during the Hafez Assad era, the institution of the Ba'ath was on board, and to send the message, especially to the Americans, Hafez al-Assad at one time had sent the Assistant Secretary General of the Ba'ath Party, Abdullah al-Ahmar, to the United States, ostensibly to visit with expatriates and so on. The institution of the army also is on board, and we remember here when the late President Assad had dispatched Lieutenant General Hikmet Shabi, the former Chief of Staff of the army, to have technical talks with, at the time, Chief of Staff Barak. The business community certainly then and now is on board for peace, but again on the assumption that this is the June 4th lines of 1967. The only group that I was able to detect in Syria that is ambivalent about this is the Muslim Brotherhood. And when you ask them, they say if they are in power, they will not oppose the trend for peace in the Middle East. But as an opposition movement, they accuse the Assad regime of wanting to resume peace talks. This is, of course, political opportunism at its best. Now, assuming that Israeli leaders again commit to that withdrawal to the June 4th lines, will Bashar al-Assad reduce ties to Iran? And I have been here before at the Middle East Institute, I believe it was an annual conference as well, where I had argued that yes, the Syrian-Iranian strategic alliance will be scaled down. And I had pointed out to many fissures in the Syrian-Iranian relationship, which I call a marriage of convenience. And if I am going to be even more blunt, I would call a mut'a marriage. Although Syria is the junior partner in this alliance, Syria did participate in the Annapolis Conference in 2007, despite Iranian objections. Syria did hold indirect talks with Israel through Turkey, despite Iranian objections. Syria and Iran view Iraq through a different lens. There is more of a Syrian-Saudi accord on Yemen than there is with Iran. And the recent love affair between Syria and Turkey, including intelligence sharing and joint military exercises and so on. How about ties to Hezbollah and Hamas? I argue that that too will be scaled down because Hezbollah and Hamas, I believe, rightly or wrongly, serve as instruments of Syrian power. This is not to say that Hezbollah and Hamas are puppets of the Syrian regime. They are not. But if there is peace between Syria and Israel, there is no need to have a Hezbollah and Hamas for Syria. And this is not just a hypothetical. I go by the precedent in which, at the time, under Hafez al-Assad, the former vice president, Abdul Halim Khaddam, who was in charge of the Palestinian portfolio when the peace talks with Israel were going well, had gathered the guerrilla leaders in his office and asked them to go look for another job. At any rate, both Iran and Hezbollah understand the pressures that Syria is up against, and I don't believe they are overly concerned because they are convinced that Israel will not compromise. Third, assuming that Israeli leaders commit to this withdrawal to June 4th lines, will Syria sign a peace accord before Palestinians? And that truly is a very, very difficult question. And it is a question that actually is being debated in Damascus, at least when I was there something like a month ago. Syria, as you know, is embedded in two institutions, that of Arab nationalism and that of sovereignty. And as in all institutions, each one of these generates a particular role. In the first, Syria is expected to enact the defense of Arab rights. In the second, in sovereignty, Syria is expected to defend its own interests. And historically, Arab nationalism had been a major predictor of Syria's external action. But Arab nationalism has declined, and statism has inclined. Still, despite the weakening of the first and the strengthening of the second, Syria faces a role conflict.